Thank you for tuning in to Tamara for Georgia. I am Tamara Johnson Shealey, your candidate for the United States Senate. I'm an independent Democrat that believes that reparations will make America great. It is time that we unite our country once and for all. Please go to my website. It's TamaraForGeorgia.com. And please join me every Saturday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here for Tamara for Georgia.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. My apologies that we were a few minutes late this morning, but it was not my fault. My internet was not my friend. But we are here this morning. We are here with Mr. Reggie Jackson, who always brings us historical information. Good morning, Mr. Reggie.
Good morning, Tamara. Hey, modern technology, right?
Yes, Mr. Reggie, sometimes it's just not our friend. It did this last week, the same time it went out on me. And now this week, it didn't even want to even start. So,
wow. Yeah, I can imagine what that's like.
Mr. Reggie, how have you been?
I've been wonderful. It's been the last couple of weeks have been great for me. A lot of new stuff going on in my life. Just really, man, I couldn't feel better today.
Oh, wait, I need some of that magic. Let me rub the screen. We got a whole race to the United States Senate to win, Mr. Reggie. We are like 10 weeks away.
Wow.
I'm telling you, I'm burning the candle at every end right now. I don't know if I'm coming or going. I'm just trying to make sure I sleep and eat in the process.
It'll be here before you know it.
I'm ready. We talking Jim Crow from the south to the north this morning, Mr. Reggie.
Yeah. I tell people I've had a very interesting life, being born in Mississippi and then moving to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. People that don't know Milwaukee, they don't, if I say Jim Crow to the north, they don't have a clue what I'm talking about. But Milwaukee is the most segregated metropolitan area in the entire United States of America. And so my nickname for Wisconsin is Mississippi.
Mississippi.
Call it Mississippi. It's some stuff going on up here in Wisconsin. People don't like to talk about it because this idea of Midwest nice folks, but nah, that's a myth. Racism is alive and well up here, and that's why I say I moved from Jim Crow to South to Jim Crow to North, because that's the reality of life here in Wisconsin.
A lot of people don't know. They think that racism and the race relations, all the tension was in the South. And you talk to a lot of Northerners, like people in our generation, and they say, "Well, my parents, my grandparents, my great grandparents, they left the South. They never wanted to return, so they have such ugly memories of the South and Jim Crow." But they seem to just skip over, or they don't. Maybe it's just it didn't happen in the North, because that's the impression that you tend to get from those when I hear it, that Jim Crow was just a Southern thing, not something that happened in the North.
Yeah, that's the myth. That's the story that we hear, because we know all of these black folk, left Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, moved to, Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and Milwaukee and Minneapolis and all of these other places in the North. But what we don't talk about is how they were received once they got to those places. And, if you go back to Dr. King's campaign, the latter part of his life, where he came to Chicago and went out to Cicero, Illinois, which is west of Chicago, trying to lead, an effort to integrate the housing out there. He was hit in the head with a big rock, and he talked about those folks there. And he said those people were worse than anybody he had ever encountered in Alabama and Mississippi. So that tells you all you really need to know. the myth has always been that the South is the racist part of the country and the North is like the good part, right? You know, so you had the Union Army in the North fighting to free the slaves, and then the South was fighting to keep slavery. But that's not really how it played out. People in the North really didn't care for those Black folks in the South who were enslaved. And then when some of those Black folk started moving to their communities, oh man, it was not a happy time for them, and they did everything in their power to make sure that, okay, you can move in this area, but you're not moving into our neighborhoods. We're going to keep our foot on your neck and keep you in a position where you're not going to enjoy the North as much as you thought you would.
So it wasn't as, you know, it's not like they left one burning, one place that was on fire, and they were still on fire where they were.
Absolutely. And you know, if you kind of look at the long-term legacy of that, the movement to the North, all of the people that moved during the Great Migration, 6 million Black people left the South and moved to the North and the West Coast, the East Coast, all those places. What you find is that when you look at how segregation is measured, segregation is generally significantly higher in the North than it is in the South. You know, I tell people this all the time, that, like, you know, when you think of segregation, you automatically think of those Jim Crow signs from back in the day, right? But you don't really understand what segregation really was. Segregation was much more than that. And one of the things that's happened over the last, 15, 20 years is a lot of, people that moved to the North, their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, whomever moved to the North. A lot of those people, particularly the younger ones, are like, man, why are we still up here in the North? So they're moving back to the South. They're moving to Atlanta, and they're moving to Charlotte, and they're moving to Houston and Dallas and Austin and, places. They're leaving, these places in the North because it's not a really good place for them to live. And so my journey really kind of started in Mississippi, Tamara. I was born in a little town in Mississippi back in 1965, a town called Charleston. Nothing really special about Charleston. It's a very small town. I mean, you could literally drive through Charleston in less than 5 minutes from one side to the other, and you're going to be out of town. The only thing noteworthy about Charleston, Mississippi is Morgan Freeman lived there, part of his childhood. So I know at one time he had a ranch that was right outside of town. I used to see him there every now and then when I would go and visit my family. He has contributed a lot of things financially to the town. He put air conditioning in the middle school that didn't have air conditioning. He built an auditorium for the high school, and they even named it after him. And he did something, that he thought would be effective back in, I think, 2006, 2007. He found out that they were still having separate proms for the Black and white kids in Charleston. So he's like, wait, they're still having a Black prom and a white prom. And that's pretty much the way it's always been. So he literally paid to have an integrated, prom. But what happens is most of the Black parents, most of the white parents wouldn't let their kids attend that integrated prom. Some did, some of their kids were just like, I don't care what you say, I'm going anyway. But they ended up, I believe, having 3 proms that year. They had the integrated prom, the Black prom, and the white prom that year. And, my family, a lot of my family still lives there in Charleston to this day. And they told me that, prior to COVID coming along and canceling the prom, they were still having separate proms as late as like 2019. So, as much as we think things have changed, they haven't changed. But I always say this: in the year that my family moved to Milwaukee, 1973, Tamara, I had gone to 2nd grade in Mississippi. So that summer we moved to Milwaukee. So, I was set to start 3rd grade in Milwaukee. And what was interesting is that a federal judge had ordered the state of Mississippi in 1970 to integrated schools. Now, everybody, well, Brown versus Board of Education was 1954, Reggie. Like, they were already integrated. I'm like, no, they weren't. Mississippi and many other states fought that tooth and nail. So it was finally 1970 when Mississippi integrated their schools. And me, being that little kid in 2nd grade, I went to school with Black and white kids in Mississippi, right? Next thing you know, family moves to Milwaukee, and I wasn't paying attention, but from 3rd grade all the way through 8th grade, the three schools I attended, because we ended up being in one neighborhood and then we moved. And so I ended up going to, two different elementary schools and then one middle school. Well, there was no white kids in any of those schools, Tamara. Not a single white kid. There was like one white family that lived in the neighborhood, but they were like older than us. So they weren't in school the same time I was. So I went from integrated schools in Mississippi to segregated schools in Milwaukee. And people are like shocked to hear that, like, wait, that's not the way things are supposed to work based on what we've been told. The segregated schools are all in the South. But hey, Milwaukee was a testament to the fact that we had segregated schools in the North. And it wasn't until I went to high school that I first had white classmates. But guess what? Milwaukee is segregated in such a way that most of the Black people live on the north side of the city and the white people live on the south side of the city. So when I went to high school, I chose to go to a school called Milwaukee Trade and Technical High School on the south side, which is in a white neighborhood, right? And so that's the first time I had white classmates. But at the end of the day, even though I had white, classmates, friends, at the end of the day, I didn't see them after school because I got on the bus and went back to the north side. They stayed on the south side. So I had no relationship with them outside of school. And I didn't think about that at the time. I didn't really realize from 3rd to 8th grade that there was no white kids. It's just like, well, we don't really see white people in the neighborhood. So it wasn't that big of a surprise. But I didn't know that somebody had filed a lawsuit against the Milwaukee Public Schools way back in 1965, the year I was born. This attorney who had been a part of the NAACP in Milwaukee had been really instrumental in talking about the segregated schools of Milwaukee. He filed a lawsuit against the Milwaukee, school board, and it went through the system for a long time. It took years, and finally in 1976, federal judge, Judge Reynolds, basically said, yeah, your schools are illegally segregated. You need to fix them. So think about this, Tamara. This is 1976 when they finally said your schools need to be fixed. They need to be integrated, with purpose. That's 22 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And this is in the North. This isn't in the South. So that's why I always tell people, like, the stories that you've been told, you really need to dig a little bit deeper to understand that it's much more nuanced than you think. It's not as cut and dried as you think in terms of how segregation played out. And, I always say that we love, Americans, we love to celebrate like the anniversary of different things, right? So, we celebrate the 30th anniversary of this, the 50th anniversary of that, all these different things we celebrate. But I tell people, stop celebrating stuff and look at what happened after that so-called event happened. And what you'll find oftentimes is that just because you passed a new law doesn't mean that that law was enforced or that people chose to say, oh, yeah, we'll abide by that law. In many cases, they didn't. And so that's why I think my journey from Mississippi to Milwaukee is really a unique journey in many ways, a journey of awakening. There's a lot of people that left Mississippi and moved to Milwaukee. But I kind of became aware of the fact that there was, the stories that I heard weren't necessarily truthful stories. And so that's what I've been trying to do for people for years, is tell that kind of the truthful story of what Milwaukee is like in terms of how they treated Black people when we moved here. For years, Black people, had no desire to move to Milwaukee because they knew that it wasn't a welcoming place. And that finally changed in the 1940s. Because of World War II. That's the only thing that made Black people start coming to Milwaukee, Tamara, is that prior to that, Milwaukee's Black population in 1930 was like 7,500 Black people, right? By 1940, it was still only 8,821 Black people, according to the census in Milwaukee in 1940. So, not much changed from 1930 to 1940. And the main reason was because Black people knew that if they came to Milwaukee, it was hard to get the good jobs in Milwaukee, those factory jobs. Milwaukee, for people who don't know, Milwaukee was like a manufacturing hub of the U.S. I remember a class that I took years ago. The professor told us that during the Cold War, now this is what he told us. I don't know if it's true or not, but it sounded like, yeah, it made sense. He said that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had maps of places they wanted to basically drop nukes on in the U.S. And the number one target was Washington, D.C., for obvious reasons. And he said the number two target was Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we said, well, why is that? He said, because of the heavy manufacturing in Milwaukee, the electrical manufacturers, heavy machinery, all of those different things. Milwaukee was really critically important to the functioning of the United States. So, Milwaukee was a place where a lot of people came to find work, but most of those people that came to find work were actually people from Europe. So we had a large number of European immigrants that had immigrated to Milwaukee from a variety of places all over Europe, particularly in the early 1900s. Milwaukee was the city that had the highest percentage of foreign-born residents of any city in the United States of America in, say, like 1910. And people don't really think about that when they think about Milwaukee. Tamara, listen, I'm not going to assume I know what your age is, but you're probably familiar with a couple TV shows that were based in Milwaukee. Maybe you're too young to remember. Happy Days, you remember Happy Days?
Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley.
Laverne and
I'm
Shirley.
your age, brother. I just color this little bit of gray. I just keep trying to color it.
So I'm sure that you remember watching Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, as a young person, same as I did. And you remember that on Laverne and Shirley, I don't think there was ever a Black character on Laverne and Shirley. And maybe the last year or so of Happy Days, they added like one Black dude. So people don't think Black people live in Milwaukee.
That one Black dude, did he even say anything? I think I seen him a few times.
He would say like one line, like every episode or something. He wasn't like a main character. But that's the thing about it. People don't know that there's like a lot of Black people in Milwaukee, right? Black people in Milwaukee are 39% of the population of the city of Milwaukee. And that's like a shock to people. We literally have a higher Black percentage than a lot of the cities that people think of as Black places. And so, there's well over 200,000 Black people in Milwaukee. But going back to what I was saying earlier, so you had all of these ethnic European groups came and they got the jobs in the factories. They got the jobs in the brewery. So when you see Laverne and Shirley and they're working in that, that brewery and everybody in there is white, that's what it would have really been like back in the day, right? So because of World War II, though, all of these factories started to change over what they were making, and they started making goods for the U.S. military. So they shifted all of these manufacturing plants in Milwaukee to, support the war effort. And of course, now they needed a lot more labor because a lot of the men that were in the city had, been sent off to Europe or off to, to Asia to fight in World War II. So now they needed labor. And so now they say, oh, well, okay. The unions will start accepting Black workers for the first time ever, right? And they actually start actively recruiting Black people from the South. They start sending freight trains down to Mississippi and Arkansas and other places, actively recruiting people. They send these, what they call agents, from these companies down to the South. And, these people are putting their lives in peril by going down there, literally stealing Black workers from the folks down in Mississippi and Alabama, Georgia, and all these other places. But what ends up happening is over the course of time, Blacks begin to build like a thriving business district in Milwaukee. So by 1950, the Black population was like 21,000. So that was a significant increase, more than double. And they built like this thriving Black business district. Had successful businesses in this one part of town, which is the only part of town Black people could live in. They were stuck in one part of town, right? They couldn't live outside this one area, but they made the best of the situation. And Milwaukee had some very famous nightclubs that were on Walnut Street in Milwaukee, like the heart of what, people refer to as Brownsville neighborhood. Milwaukee was known back at that time, Tamara, as the Harlem of the Midwest, because all of the jazz singers and performers used to come to Milwaukee to perform. But guess what happened when they got here? They came to perform in the nightclubs, right? But, the fanciest hotel in Milwaukee downtown is called the Pfister Hotel. Do you think that they allowed them to stay in that hotel, Tamara?
No.
Like, listen, man, we love y'all. Y'all famous. Y'all doing really well. Everybody knows who y'all are, but y'all not staying in this hotel. So guess where these Black, very famous performers, musicians, singers, they had to live in the homes of Black people in Milwaukee. They literally had Black people that opened their doors and let all of these people, Cab Calloway and all of these famous people, like, oh yeah, y'all can come and stay with us. So there was families that took them in. And so, they realized like, okay, this is the North, but man, segregated hotels in Milwaukee, which probably would have been a shock to some people. So what ends up happening is over the course of time, the Black population continues to grow because those manufacturing plants, even after the war ends, the jobs continue to be there. And the Black population, by 1960 ends up being 62,000. So that Black business district on Walnut Street became really, really significant for the Black population, because we had, at that time in 1950, we had the highest per capita Black business ownership rate of any city in the country. The Black population is pretty small. We had a lot of Black owned businesses. But what ends up happening, unfortunately, the federal government starts to institute a program called urban renewal. And what urban renewal is that, the government will give cities money to tear down what they call slum houses, right? Slum clearance is what they refer to it as. And so Milwaukee gets all of this money for that. And one of the first projects they do is to tear down everything on Walnut Street. The Black business district on Walnut Street disappears like overnight. They tear down everything. Half of all Black-owned businesses in Milwaukee are destroyed by this urban renewal program. Over 400 residents in that neighborhood are, displaced, and 98% of them were Black people. So you had a situation where, Black people came and they made the best out of a bad situation. And then the federal government and the local government here, the mayor's office, they tore all of that down. We still haven't really fully recovered from that. And what the federal government called urban renewal, Black people referred to by a couple different terms. They called it urban removal or Negro removal, because that's literally what it did. These programs around the country, 90% of homes destroyed were owned by Black and brown folks. 75% of the homes were never rebuilt. So that really devastated the Black community. So
that happened here in Lennon, Georgia as well, over in Athens, where they literally came in, destroyed the whole community, and built a dormitory and a parking lot for the university.
Wow. So, we saw this happen all over the country, right? North, south, east, and west. And so around the same time that this stuff is happening, the late 50s, I think they started that urban renewal project in 1957 in Milwaukee. But if you go back a couple years in time, go back to 1955, a really important event happened, and that was the kidnapping and murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi, in Money, Mississippi. And I tell people that I feel connected to the Emmett Till story, and it's the number 37 that connects me to the Emmett Till story. It's really, I haven't figured out why the number 37 kind of follows me around, but Money, Mississippi is literally 37 miles from my hometown in Mississippi. I was born 37 days shy of the 10th anniversary of Emmett Till being murdered. And then I became involved with America's Black Holocaust Museum the year that I turned 37. So it's something about the number 37. It's like, follow me around. But going back to Mississippi, Emmett Till, most people know the story of this 14-year-old kid from Chicago visiting his relatives. A lot of people in Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, other places used to send their kids what they would call back down south for the summer, right? Let them hang out with their cousins and aunts and uncles, whomever down south. And then they come back, right before the school year started, and, they be good to go. Well, Emmett Till was down there visiting, and he went into a store owned by the Bryant family, white family. And we really don't know exactly what happened, because he didn't get to tell what happened, because he was murdered. And then the woman who was involved basically said that he was flirting with her. Some accounts say that he whistled at her, all these different versions of what happened. But the bottom line is that she ended up telling her husband, and then him and his brother-in-law basically went into Emmett Till's uncle's house, who he was staying with. Mose Wright was his name. And they came in, busted in the middle of the night, a group of men, some white men and some Black men too, helping them out. And they kidnapped Emmett Till at gunpoint, and they took him, and they beat this boy, this 14-year-old boy. They beat him horribly, horribly. And he was a tough kid apparently, and we find out how tough he is because the man who murdered him ended up telling exactly what they did later. But I'll get to that in a second. So anyway, they're torturing this boy, and he basically was standing up to them. He wasn't gonna be a person who was just gonna let them do what they did to him without speaking up for himself. But they eventually they murdered him. They shot him in the head, And then they took his body. And they had driven from Money, Mississippi. They had driven further west in the state. And what they did is after they murdered him, right before they went and picked him up, they went and they stole a cotton gin fan. So they stole this big heavy fan with the intention of using that to tie it to his body and weigh his body down once they dumped him in the Tallahatchie River. So they joke about the fact that they probably get in more trouble for stealing that fan than they would for killing Emmett Till. That's the joke that they made with each other, right? So they murdered him, and then they tied some barbed wire to his body, tied it to this big heavy fan, and they dumped this 14-year-old kid's body in the Tallahatchie River, thinking it would sink to the bottom and nobody would ever see Emmett Till again. So of course, the family reports that he's missing. They're searching all over the place for him, and a fisherman found his body floating in the water. His body broke away and floated to the surface. And what's amazing about the story is his mother, came down from Chicago, and they had her son's body in a box. They were about to bury her son before she even got there. They had his body in a wooden box, about to bury him, and she's like, "No, open this up. I want to see my son." So, she saw how horribly disfigured her son was, and she said, "Y'all not burying my son. I'm taking my son back to Chicago. I'm going to give him a proper burial in Chicago." So his mother, Mamie Till, she took her son back and had an open casket funeral on purpose. She said, "I want y'all to see what these men did to my son." I mean, the images were, just grotesque. His head was swollen. It's just you can probably see the images online because some of the local or national black magazines, Ebony and Jet, actually put the pictures in their magazine so people could see. And there's estimates that something like 50,000 people attended his funeral in Chicago, right? So that was like a really important story, and it happened really close to my hometown. But all the time I was a kid, I never heard the story of Emmett Till. Nobody ever said anything about it, and that was really the launching point of black people just saying enough already. They'd murdered this little boy enough, and that was really the launching point of the civil rights movement. The same, just a couple months after this happened was when the Montgomery bus boycott started. Emmett Till's murdered in September. The bus boycott starts in December of that year. So it was really a very instrumental event in the lives of black people. And I say all the time, like, I grew up real close to where they kidnapped Emmett Till. And I used to tell my family when I was going to visit, I'm like, I'm going to go over to Money, Mississippi, just do some research. And they're like, "Reggie, you can't do that, man. You can't go over to Money, Mississippi asking any questions about Emmett Till." They like, "Dude, you may disappear in the middle of the night." I'm like, "What do you mean?" They like, "Those folks over there do not want anybody talking about Emmett Till." They had buried that story. Even though it was a kind of a story that was a national story, people knew about it. They was like, down in Money? No, you can't do it. So I listened to my family, and I never went. But eventually, things kind of changed. And now people, know about it. They have a little museum there to memorialize Emmett Till. And, people are willing to talk about it. But at that time, 10, 15, 20 years ago, when I was thinking of going down there, it was like, "No, dude, can't do it." So I never heard about that when I was in school in Mississippi, in Milwaukee. I never heard the Emmett Till story until I was a grown man. It was the first time I remember hearing about it. And it touched me in a way because I was like, my family used to send me down to Mississippi in the summer, right? And some of my cousins used to come up from Mississippi to visit us in the summer. So it was like, Emmett Till was like, that story, it touched me in a very important way. So now I'm getting back to Milwaukee. So here I am in Milwaukee, going to these segregated schools and living in a neighborhood that was all black. And, I tell people that it didn't bother me to be in this so-called segregated neighborhood that was all black. It was all good. It was a great neighborhood to grow up in. It was a safe neighborhood. I had a lot of friends. We used to play basketball in our backyard. We had a basketball hoop in our backyard. We used to run up and down the street, racing each other. We used to play football in the middle of the street. They call it pole to pole. So anybody who's ever lived in a big city and played football in the street, you go from one light pole to the next light pole. Like, okay, that's the end zone for that team, and this is the end zone for that team. We out there catching the ball and catching it and running into a car that's parked on the street and stuff. It was fun. It was kind of crazy that we did that stuff, but we used to ride our bikes. down to the lakefront in Milwaukee, down to Lake Michigan, ride the bike trails down there. We used to go all over the place. Nobody ever bothered us. Milwaukee was a beautiful place to live as a kid, but I didn't know that part of Milwaukee was off limits for Black folks. So what happened when Black people left the South during the Great Migration, and this happened all over the North, is that white people were not happy about it. They did not want Black people living in their neighborhoods. So we've all heard of this term called redlining, right? So redlining it comes from, I think there's a lot of misinformation about redlining, but what redlining is the federal government created an organization in the 1930s called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And they went to 239 cities around the country and they drew what people refer to as redlining maps. But the federal government didn't call them redlining maps. They called them residential security maps. And these maps were drawn and they designated, the cities by 4 different designations and 4 different colors. So green was the best neighborhoods, blue was the next best neighborhoods, yellow were what they call definitely declining neighborhoods, and then red were what they call hazardous neighborhoods, right? So if the neighborhood was hazardous, that meant that it was practically impossible for you to go to a bank and get a loan to buy a house or to get a loan to buy a building for a business. So that red area, the hazardous, became what people refer to as redlining. And what's interesting about it, in all those 239 cities, if there were Black folks in those cities, Tamara, that neighborhood was going to be redlined because they were considered, and this is the term the federal government used, they were considered to be inharmonious racial group. An inharmonious racial group, right? So when you look at Chicago, you look at Detroit, you look at Milwaukee, you look at Cleveland, you look at Minneapolis, you look at all these different cities where these maps are drawn, and you'll find that every single one of them where the Black people live was hazardous. So what does that mean? That means that if you're a Black person and you're trying to buy a house, you can't buy no house because no bank will give you the money because they're not going to give you this because that federal government, along with local realtors and bankers, have said, oh, that's a hazardous area. That's a dangerous area to give a loan. So Black people don't have the ability to buy houses the way white people do in the North, right? So you're thinking, man, the South, a lot of Black people were homeowners in the South, but in the North, nah, man, sorry. Your neighborhood is redlined. You can't buy a house here. You can't. So how do Black people end up buying houses? In Milwaukee, we were fortunate in Milwaukee because there was a family that moved to Milwaukee from Georgia. The Halyard family, they moved to Milwaukee in the 1920s and they opened up with $10. They used $10 and they opened up what was called Columbia Savings and Loan. And eventually Columbia Savings and Loan grew and grew and grew. And they became the only place in Milwaukee that would give you a loan if you're a Black person to buy a house. Literally the only bank in town that would give you money to buy a house. And then, of course, they loan money to white people too. Hispanics, the small Mexican population where we get loans from them as well. But that just shows you, like, you have a situation in the North where it's supposed to be so much better, right? Racism isn't existing in the North, that's the South. But no, racism was very strong. And what's even more important than the redlining is they use what they called racial restricted covenants, Tamara. So these were attached to the deeds of property. So let's just say Tamara wants to buy a house in the suburbs of Milwaukee or within certain neighborhoods of Milwaukee. Well, there may be this attachment to that deed that says that basically only white people can occupy this property. Nobody can rent, lease, own, occupy these properties unless they're white. And I mean, that's literally what they said, only to be occupied by white people, right? It wasn't like they were trying to cover it up. They were very, in your face with it, saying, oh, well, sorry, Tamara, we know you want to buy this house out here, in the suburbs of Milwaukee, but what you see right here, because you're a Negro, you can't buy, you can't rent, you can't lease, you can't even be in that property unless you work for them. If you're like a domestic worker, oh, Tamara, you can be there during your work day. You can occupy the space at that time. But when your work day is over, you got to be out of there. You can't legally be in this space. And so these were used all over the country, Tamara, all over the country. Nobody knows how many of these are written because it's really hard to find them. But what they did is they created all white neighborhoods all over the country. And they were promoted by the Federal Housing Administration. They said, okay, if you want to get the best rating on these maps that we've drawn, you got to have racial restricted covenants in place, keeping inharmonious racial groups out of those neighborhoods. And if you do that, oh, we'll give you the green rating. We'll give you the blue rating. In fact, none of the places that got a green rating in all of those maps, Not a single place that got a green rating didn't have some racial restricted covenants in place already. So that was the main tool the white people used for decades to create all white spaces, particularly in the North. So when Black people moving here to Chicago, there were certain areas you couldn't move to. Detroit, Cleveland, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, all of these places, certain neighborhoods you couldn't move to because you weren't white. And that's like so blatantly discriminatory, so blatantly racist, but people don't know that happened, Tamara. They just assume, oh yeah, Black people left the South. It was so horrible with Jim Crow and those ugly signs. We had Jim Crow in the North. We just didn't have the signs, Tamara. We didn't have no whites only, colored only, blah, blah, blah. But in Milwaukee, there were like stores that wouldn't hire Black people. Literally, you know, you see the pickets in the South, you know, Black people picket in this store, you know, picket in this restaurant. They did the same thing in Milwaukee because certain stores wouldn't hire Black people in downtown Milwaukee. Nope, sorry, only white people can work here. And so the racism is very strong. And I tell people that part of the reason I call Wisconsin, Mississippi, is that the racism is just, man, it's so strong throughout the state of Wisconsin. But most Black people in Wisconsin live in the city of Milwaukee. So Blacks only make up about a little over 6% of the population of the entire state of Wisconsin, right? But most Black people, 66% of Black people in the whole state, Tamara, live in one county, Milwaukee County. 61% of all Black people in the state of Wisconsin live in the city of Milwaukee. So when you leave Milwaukee, there's a couple of the cities you go to where you see a decent number of Black folk, but around most of the state, you're not going to see many Black folk. And I travel all over the state. I've done work, you know, with my company in over 50 different communities around the state. So I've been all over the place. And I go to these places like, man, you're not going to see many people that look like me in those places. And so it's not because, well, Black people chose not to live in some of those little towns and stuff. They used to live in some of those little towns, Samira. But then they had what they call sundown towns. I don't know if you're familiar with sundown towns at all. You know what that is?
Yeah, you better get the hell out of here before it get dark.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So
you better be gone before that sunset.
Absolutely. So, you know, the guy that kind of studied that and wrote a book about it, James Lowen, and he started looking at sundown towns. He thought most of them would be in the South. But what he found was most of them were in the North, and particularly in the Midwest, in Illinois, in Indiana, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Minnesota. So you had all of these towns that, you know, for a while, Black people were okay working in those towns back in the day. But eventually white people were like, well, you know what? We don't, not only do we not want you working here, we don't want you living here either. So these towns that had a lot of Black folk just left because they knew they weren't welcome. And eventually they was like, well, man, well, we still need some of y'all to work here. So y'all can come and work. But, you know, when the sun set, your behind better be out of town. And so that's another manifestation of how racism works in the North that people don't know about. Because, you know, you watch Laverne and Shirley, Happy Days, that 70s show, which is based in Milwaukee, and it looked like everything is all good. But man, Tamara, it's not. And in Milwaukee, people don't really understand Milwaukee. They don't know much about Milwaukee, right? Because, you know, you ask the average person where Milwaukee is, they couldn't find it on the map because they don't know, right? And generally we're like, oh, well, we know about 90 miles north of Chicago, right on the, you know, the western shore of Lake Michigan. That's the only way somebody gonna find Milwaukee generally. You know, even though we got, you know, a basketball team that won the NBA championship last year, you know, we got a baseball team that did really well last year, won their division. Is people still don't know what Milwaukee is. And so when they come here, it's like a shock to the system, how segregated Milwaukee is. Like most of the Black people in Milwaukee live on the north side and the northwest side of the city. Hispanics live on the south side. White people live on the east side and the far west side of the city and part of the south side. So it's like very regimented in terms of the segregation here. But what makes Milwaukee stand out from other segregated places is our suburbs are the whitest suburbs in the entire country, Tamara. By far the whitest. Nobody's suburbs are as white as the suburbs of Milwaukee. So when you leave the city and you go out to these suburban communities and even out further beyond the suburbs to what they call the exurban communities, you really gonna see like super duper white places, right? So let me just tell you the demographics of Milwaukee. 32% white, 39% Black, 20% Hispanic, about 5% Asian, and about 1% Native American. So a very, very diverse city, right? And in Milwaukee County, there's 18 suburbs that surround the city of Milwaukee, right? And when you look at the population of all of those suburbs combined, 74% of the people that live in those suburbs are white. So a very diverse city surrounded by not diverse suburbs. And then when you go to the counties that wrap around Milwaukee County, Waukesha County, Ozaukee County, Washington County, they are 89%, 90%, and 91% white. So when you leave the city of Milwaukee, you're not going to see many black folk here in this area, right? And everybody that's black in Milwaukee knows this. So you know what we do, Tamara?
What?
We try not to go out to that part of Metro Milwaukee, you know, because we know that we're not going to see people like us for the most part. We're not going to feel very welcome when we go to those places. We're much more likely to get pulled over by the police when we go to those places. We're going to be racially profiled, you know, by the police. We're going to be racially profiled when we go shopping in the malls out in, you know, these very, very white places. They're going to follow us around the store. We know that this happens because, you know, we hear it all the time. But, you know, listen, we want to enjoy the good things in life just like everybody else. So you know what? Some people are like, man, I'm going to go out to that mall because they got better shops than the mall that's close to where I live. You know, I'm going to go to those restaurants because those are nice restaurants. So people, you know, they take their chances. But we have, you know, places that, you know, the police really are not right. I want to give you an example. Our nearest suburban neighbor to the west of Milwaukee is a place called Wauwatosa, right? People call it Tosa for short. And it's a very white place. You know, it's more black people moving there now than there ever has been before, but it's a very, very white place. And so a number of years ago, you had a police officer in Wauwatosa, a black police officer, Tamara. He was a police officer there for 5 years, right? And over those 5 years, there were 3 people who were shot and killed by the Wauwatosa Police Department. In those 5 years, he was a police officer. 3 people shot and killed by the entire Wauwatosa Police Department. He killed all 3 of those people all by himself. 1 black police officer shot and killed 2 black men and 1 black teenager over the 5 years he's a police officer. Nobody else, none of the rest of the cops out there shot and killed anybody. This 1 officer shot and killed 3 black males, and they refused to fire him. They refused to fire him. They refused to charge him with a crime in any of those. So he never faced any charges in any of those. 1 guy was literally in his car sleeping in a park in the middle of the night, and this guy shot him and killed him after waking him up. Woke him up and then shot him and killed him. And then the last person he shot and killed was a kid, 17-year-old kid who was at the mall, got into a fight with some folks, running away from the cops. And, you know, he was armed, but he's running away from the mall like, you know, the rest of the guys that was in the fight. And this cop shot him and killed him. His name was Alvin Cole, 17-year-old kid. And so, of course, after this happens for the 3rd time, the black community in Milwaukee is like, y'all need to do something about this man. Y'all need to fire this officer. He is hazardous to black folks' health in Wauwatosa. And so they had all of these, you know, marches and protests there. And Tamara, if you would have seen the news coverage of it, you would have thought that you were somewhere where it was like a military engagement. They had these big, gigantic tanks. You know, the police got these tanks and armored vehicles for some peaceful protesters. Now, there was some windows that was busted up, some businesses, but other than that, it was not. I mean, come on, nobody was throwing Molotov cocktails at the police or you know, shooting at the police, and none of that happened. It was peaceful protests, and I know a lot of the people that were protesting, black as well as whites, and the show of force that they had was tremendous. You would have thought it was like somewhere in the Ukraine right now with all of the military hardware they had out there, and that, you know, that wasn't all that long ago. So what black people in Milwaukee can tell you is that, you know, some of these suburbs are not places that you want to hang out in. And even within the city of Milwaukee, the way we're racially profiled by the police is just, man, it's something else, Tamara. You know, we live in a place where the governor, former governor, Scott Walker, was a county executive in Milwaukee for years and was terrible. Eventually was elected governor of Wisconsin. They used to have a rule in Wisconsin, a law that went back, I don't know, 100 years, right? They said if you work for any of the city governments, you have to live in that city. So, for instance, if you live in Milwaukee and you want to be a police officer, you have to live in Milwaukee. If you live in Milwaukee, you want to be a teacher, you have to live in Milwaukee. Firefighter, have to live in Milwaukee, right? And that was the way it was for years. And then Scott Walker decided, well, no, we're going to change that law. Him and the Republican legislature changed the law. And they said, no, you don't have to live in those cities anymore. You have to live within 15 miles of those cities. So guess what happens to all of those police officers and firefighters and teachers that used to live in the city of Milwaukee and would be in the neighborhoods or somewhere close to the neighborhoods where their students were? They left the city in droves. We don't know what the impact was with the teachers because they haven't really said. But 2 years ago, the local newspaper here did an investigation. They found that 45% of police officers had left the city of Milwaukee to move somewhere else. 45% of firefighters had left the city of Milwaukee and moved out to the suburbs. So now you have these cops and these firefighters who used to live in the city. Now they're disinvested from the city because now, well, guess what? They're going to go buy a home out in the suburbs. All right. They're going to put their kids in the schools in the suburbs. Now all of their new neighbors are going to be in the suburbs. All of their friends are going to be in the suburbs. So now they detach from the city of Milwaukee, but they come back into the city to work every day. And you can imagine what the racial dynamics being difficult to begin with. But now you have all of these, and majority of the police in Milwaukee are white. You have a lot of these white police officers pack up and move out to the suburbs. And, you know, out in the suburbs, they hear all these horrible things about how Milwaukee is so terrible. And, you know, black people in Milwaukee constantly shooting and killing each other and, you know, doing this, that, and the other. You hear nothing positive about Milwaukee, particularly black community, when you read the news, particularly in the suburbs. And so now you got these officers that go out there. What do you think their conversations are like, Tamara, when they go out to the suburbs and their neighbors are racist and saying all this racist stuff about the black people in Milwaukee? Do you think that that's going to have some impact on what they say to their neighbors?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, right? It's going to have an impact on the way they police. This is the hypocritical part about it. So the police department claims that they're doing what they call community policing, right? How can you call it community policing when those officers don't even live in the community? How can they do community policing when at the end of their shift, they pack up their gear and they move out to the suburbs to go sleep in their beds out in the suburbs? You can't do community policing if you don't live in the community. And, you know, that was 2 years ago when they released those figures, you know, the local newspaper did. I'm sure that right now those numbers are even worse. I'm sure that more than half of the police officers and firefighters in Milwaukee are probably living out in the suburbs now. And, you know, it's one of those situations. It's a very volatile situation. Back in 2016 here in Milwaukee, 3 blocks from my house, Tamara, 3 blocks, literally 3 blocks from my house. A young black man was shot and killed by a black police officer. Kid's name he was 23. Seville Smith was his name. He was in the car with his friend. They were like parked on the side of side of the street, but they weren't parked properly, right? They were kind of out in the street. So police squad drives past. Oh, look how they parked. Okay, they get out. And as soon as the cops get out, Seville Smith and the other guy in the car, they jump out and start running, right? So Seville Smith is running through some yards, and then he jumps over a fence, and the gun he had literally fell out of his pocket as he jumped over the fence. Fell out of his pocket. The cop saw the gun, and the cop shot him and killed him. Now, okay, he was armed, but when you shot him, he was no longer armed. The gun had fallen out of his pocket. You could clearly see that. And, you know, they ended up deciding, and this never happens in Long. They decided to charge that officer. They were going to charge that officer. So what ends up happening, that officer ends up not getting charged with, you know, killing Seville Smith. He's charged because they find out that he has been sexually assaulting boys. So that's what the charges they bring him up on. And it ends up not ending well. He ends up, you know, killing himself before he faces the charges. So what happens after Seville Smith is shot? That day, Tamara, I'll never forget that day. I was on my way to Chicago to visit with one of my cousins. Her daughter had, you know, gotten a scholarship to play basketball in college. She was on her way, you know, to college, back to college. And I wanted to go hang out with her and, you know, celebrate her daughter's accomplishment and whatnot. And so I'm driving and I see all of these people outside, like a ton of people outside. I see all of these police cars. I don't have a clue what's going on. So eventually I left. I went to Chicago. I'm coming back. I'm listening to the radio. And, I turned to the news radio station and like, there's civil unrest in Milwaukee and they're fighting with the police and there's fires have been set and blah, blah. So I'm thinking like, man, what's going on? Because I know that this is right by my house. This is literally 3 blocks from my house, right? So I called my wife and I'm like, are you okay? She's like, yeah, I'm okay. I'm like, really? Are you okay? She's like, yeah, why wouldn't I be okay? I'm like, do you know what's going on? She's like, what do you mean? I said, turn on the TV. So she turns on the news and you're seeing, they got all of these streets blocked off. There's fires have been set, all of this different stuff. I finally make it back home and, we're watching the news later that night and just seeing, and now the next day I got all of these friends and relatives from around the country calling me, Reggie, y'all okay? I see the Milwaukee's on fire. I'm like, dude, Milwaukee ain't on fire. There's like 8 fires set, 8. And like one of them, which is broadcast on the international news, is a gas station that they set on fire. And the rest of them was like 7, 8 blocks away. So everybody's thinking that it's really, really bad, but it was never really that bad, the civil unrest in Milwaukee. But that was a reaction by young people in Milwaukee. I went and talked to some of these young folks, and this is what they told me. They said the reason that all of this stuff jumped off because they said Seville Smith could have been them. They said the police harass us on a regular basis, pulling us over unnecessarily, making us sit on a snowbank in the middle of December, January, February when it's snowing outside, harassing us, cussing us out, doing all kinds of stuff. I even had a couple of guys that told me the police took them in the alley and beat the crap out of them and threw them in the alley. So that just came out in the civil unrest because people are like, Milwaukee is the worst. And one of our aldermen, actually my alderman, said that Milwaukee is the worst place in the country for Black people to live. But all kind of indicators tell you that. And so Jim Crow of the North is alive and well, Tamara.
That was so much, Mr. Reggie. It was so much to unpack there. I keep thinking about like the segregation and the integration. And did integration really help us? As a people, did integration really, really, really help us? Having our own communities, when you talked about how they wouldn't let the entertainers that came there to perform, they couldn't stay at the white hotels. But imagine the economy that was created because they wouldn't. Like, to hell with it. You don't want us to stay at your hotel? We'll stay with this family and we'll give them something. So that family had a little extra money. They cooked, so I'm sure they ate. And the way we do it, I'm sure somebody was selling some dinners. Somebody made some money off the food, and I'm sure there was. We had our own economy. So when I hear these stories about Jim Crow and the integration, that I'm like, did it really help? I see so much good in the fact that we were segregated.
Listen, Tamara, people don't realize this because the way we teach history, we say that Black people were fighting for integration. We weren't fighting for integration, Tamara. We were fighting for desegregation, which is something completely different. Desegregation meant that, listen, we have a choice to go wherever we want to go. You can't tell us we can't go to certain places. But it wasn't like Black people's like, oh, we want to sit at the lunch counter with white people. We want to go to school with white people. We were content being what we were. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that came out of this is we lost a lot of Black teachers. When they closed all of those Black-only schools, all of those Black kids ended up going to white schools. Their teachers couldn't go with them because they wouldn't hire Black teachers. We lost the base of our educational system, Black teachers that cared, Black administrators that cared. It was one of the worst things that ever happened to us, but we don't acknowledge it. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about the Black business districts that we had in places around the country that really ended up, losing out because Black people said, okay, well, the white man's ice is colder than the Black man's ice. So let me go over here to this other side of town and buy their ice instead of your ice. And that was like really one of the things that devastated us.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I think integration has taught us, that our communities were good enough. Our Black stores, our Black restaurants, our Black businesses, their ice was just as damn cold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Ice is ice.
Ice is ice. Oh, Mr. Reggie, it's always a pleasure, sir. We learn so much every third Saturday here on the broadcast with Mr. Reggie Jackson. If y'all haven't gone to his website, please do, reggiejacksoninc.com. Make a donation. Mr. Reggie does this, y'all, every third Saturday here, and he's out speaking and he's doing a lot of stuff. Just do something, just blessing y'all. Reggie, I always enjoy you and I appreciate you. You are a wealth of knowledge. And, you know, our fight for reparations, I look forward to, you know, all of this coming to fruition because we get to recreate what we lost. You know, we get to create communities and have our businesses and have our own structure. We get to have our own economies again. So I'm excited about all of this that we're doing. Somebody put in the chat about that 37. I thought that was so interesting, Mr. Reggie. I'm gonna say it out loud. I was gonna actually tell it to you offline, but I'm gonna say it. Let me find the actual, where is it? Oh, I don't see it. Where is it? Let me find it. I wanna speak to it because, oh, there it is. Divine Life. 37, all the threes add up. And I'm not into numerology, but I do have this where the ones follow me, Mr. Reggie. You said that 37 follow you, ones follow me. So when this person put in that it added up to 1, and that's a new beginning and it's divine. And I believe that is probably our divine connection because we are doing some great work, Mr. Reggie. So I just thought that was interesting. And I was like, oh, that's a whole nother level of that, of how deep this work is and how the ancestors and how God is moving. So yeah. Mr. Reggie, thank you, sir.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure, Tamara. Looking forward to seeing you next month on Saturday. Yes. And you know, next week we'll be doing the next session of our conversations about reparations and the proof for that. So
Reparations Sunday, y'all. Mr. Reggie also does that twice a month, and that series has been fire. So thank you, Mr. Reggie, for all that you are doing. All
right. Well, always a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, Tamara, and see you next time.
See you soon. Y'all have a great weekend, everybody. See y'all next week.
When we come to Washington in this campaign, we're coming to get our check. Young prodigies. Grow. Free.
Reparations, Martin said we coming for our check. Reparations, say it loud. 1, 2, mic check. Cream. Cash rules everything around me. Dream. My legacy, you can't stop me. Coming for our 40 acres, H.I. 40 and our paper.
Kicking the door. Coming for our 40 acres and more. Our 6.4 trillion. Miss that no, we fought the Civil War.
We came from the poor.
Start from the bottom, we still on the floor. We pray to the Lord.
Amen. Picking the cotton, our fingers are sore.
Straight out the underground, escaping from slavery. The only cemeteries that we had were the trees. Watching our bodies while they blew in the breeze. Niggas to the north side to get free.
That way came from slavery. Where's on the mirror once you sit on me? Put her head on the door, put the werewolf schemes. Stick to the north side to get free.
Reparations, Martin said we coming for our check. Reparations, say it loud. 1, 2, mic check. Cream. Cash rules everything around me. Dream. My legacy, you can't stop me. Coming for our 40 acres, H.I. 40 and our paper.
We taking them back. Putting Pettis Bridge on the map. Police came with the strap. That son niggas buddy, no cap.
Some capping.
Speaking of cap, Kaepernick taking knees at the flag. Where my justice at? We built this nation, better give me them racks. All fat, just imagine a little bit of gasoline. 4 girls got burned back in 63.
400 years, yeah, we still ain't free. I rise, we rise, take a knee.
Kaepernick.
Reparations, Martin said we coming for our check. Reparations, say it loud. 1, 2, mic check. Cream. Cash rules everything around me. Dream. My legacy, you can't stop me.
Coming for our 40 acres, H.I. 40 and our paper.
We stuck in the trap with no shoes, trying to pull up bootstraps. Increasing the gap. Wealth got bigger, so we had to adapt. Discriminated cause we black. I know it worth more than I know it's a fact. They tryna feel scraps. Strike me on board so we can't come back.
30 years ago on April 19, Yusef and Try Raymond Chemical Reed.
If it happened to them, think it happened to me. Screaming, I ready